everyone. How is that is that close? Close enough? All right. Do you not hear? Okay. All right. Well, good morning, everyone. It's so fun to be back and see all your faces. Thank you, Joanna, for the invitation to be here. And before I forget, there are some things that I brought. You know, I was limited on luggage, so there's not a lot, but there are a few things like a cookbook from Iona and a book about the history and a lovely little photo book that one of the other volunteers made and gave us all. So Iona Abbey. How many of you know about Iona? Some of you.
Just from you.
Just from me, okay. So what is it about this place that is estimated there's something like 65,000 people visit in a year?
In a year?
In a year. Oh, I need to advance. How do I? Okay. And you're going to have to keep doing it because I did the fancy. Sorry, I did that now. So let me give you some background to Iona. First of all, there are many islands off the west coast, the north coast as well. But there are a lot of islands off the west coast of Scotland, and Iona is there. By the way, the Isle of Mull that Jan has ancestry in is right there. So Iona is located in what's called the Hebrides ring set of islands. There's the Inner Hebrides where Iona and Mull are located. If you go further west, it's called the Outer Hebrides. That's where Lewis and Harris, if you know Harris Tweed, that's where it hails from. You can only have Harris Tweed on the label if it's woven on that little island. So would you do one more for us, please? So Iona is called an island off an island off an island. This is the Abbey, obviously. You're looking towards, this is Mull, and behind there is another island called Jura. There's 3 peaks. It wasn't always visible, but sometimes we could see Jura off in the distance. There's varying theories about the name Iona. Some people feel that the origins are back in the Hebrew language. It's obviously also a Gaelic word. Gaelic was the language of the Celtic people of Ireland and Scotland. Now, there still are some people who speak Gaelic in the Outer Hebrides Islands, and it's actually being taught again in schools. And kind of like if you go to northern Minnesota and you see some of the signs in Ojibwe and in English, there's areas that you see both Gaelic and English signs. Okay, next one, please. Sorry, you're going to be doing this a bit. So I first heard about Iona Abbey shortly after seminary when a classmate of mine visited and took a class there, a study leave time. I was intrigued by the place as she described it, the remoteness, how unlike other retreats or conferences, you were considered to be a part of the community for that time, that week that you were there. So much so that you actually had a task, a job that you did while you were there. It was not until I was on sabbatical some 10 years ago that I finally got to Iona myself. I took a course while I was there on environmental spirituality, and while I was there I met a Presbyterian pastor, I think she was from South Carolina, who was volunteering on Iona, and I tucked away the idea that someday I would like to do that, and so when I retired in December, I realized someday had come, and I applied and was accepted to volunteer there for 3 months. Next, please. Iona is often described as a thin place. The use of that term, thin place, comes from the Celtic tradition. It describes a special place where the veil between the spiritual or the heavenly and the earthly or our existence is very thin, where you can feel the presence of God in a way you don't in other places. This is a quote from George MacLeod, who was the founder of the Iona community. I'll get to that later, when he described Iona as a holy isle, a thin place where only tissue paper separates the material from the spiritual. Okay, next please. A little background to the place. It's a very small island. It's about 1.5 miles wide and 3 miles long. It's a rugged landscape of stone. It's a beautiful coastline. There's beaches, there's lots of sheep. I sometimes thought there were more sheep than people. And of course, the historic abbey. It is a very rugged place, so while you would think you could just walk around the island, there's too many cliffs on certain areas, so you cannot actually walk all the way around. It's also very boggy in places, so either you need to have rain boots on or you're going to get wet feet when you walk. Okay, there's another one. So this is a map of Iona. Here's the ferry, here's the abbey. I'll talk about beaches up there and St. Columba's Bay down there in a moment. All right, next please. So getting to Iona is part of the fun. It's a pilgrimage to get there. The closest international airport to fly into is Glasgow. From there, you take a 3-hour train ride, a beautiful train ride, northwest to the town of Oban, which is on the west coast of Scotland. From Oban, it's a 50-minute ferry ride across to the Isle of Mull. Then on the Isle of Mull, you take an 1.5 hour bus ride across Mull, much bigger island, to the west side of Mull, and finally you take a 10-minute ferry across the Sound of Iona, and you get to Iona. All right, do you want to do one more? Getting there has always been a pilgrimage, but to me that's part of the experience. People do visit for a day, but if you are going, I recommend you stay because it takes so long to get there. Also, ferries can limit the time that you're able to come and go. It's an island, so there's only one way off and on unless you're somebody who has a helicopter. So people would often ask me about worship, and they missed it because of the ferry times. They stopped running at a certain time in the day. Once on the island, the pilgrimage is not quite over. There are no buses on Iona, and so you walk the rest of the way from the ferry up to the abbey. In fact, the only cars that are on the island are people who live there year-round. The population of the island is about 120 people, some of whom work in the shops or the hotels, or maybe also at the abbey. They maybe are fishing people, they raise sheep and cattle. It's a very quiet place without traffic. If I saw 5 cars in a day, I thought I'd been a part of a rush hour. Okay. So Iona is called the birthplace of Christianity in Scotland. Next, please. Sorry, I did this fancy thing. You can keep going. So in 563, there were a group of monks that sailed from Ireland and landed on Iona. They were led by a monk named Columba, who was a priest, a musician, a scribe, and a scholar. Columba started a monastery on Iona, which was to become one of the most significant in early medieval Europe. Let's see. So Columba sent out missionaries to spread Christianity. That's really how Christianity entered what we call the United Kingdom today. Iona became a center for education, and by the 8th century was an artistic center with sculptors and metalworkers and manuscript illuminators. It's held that the Book of Kells was created on Iona. This is St. Columba's Bay, where they believe he landed. And there's a couple more here. That's a page from the Book of Kells. How many of you know about the Book of Kells? Quite a few of you. So it's a hand-illuminated Bible, beautiful piece of artwork as well as history. It is in Ireland. It's in Dublin at Trinity College. If you're ever in Ireland, make sure you go and see it. It's considered a national treasure of Ireland, but it was done on Iona.
I might say it's actually fairly easy to get in there.
Yeah.
Like some museums.
Yes, yeah. Anymore, so many museums you need to make your reservations way in advance. So that's good to know. You can get in there. So St. Columba's Bay, as I said, it was on the south coast of that small little island. And you can find there, I don't know if you can really see, but in the large picture, it's a very rocky beach. There's other beaches on the island that are sand, pure sand. I don't know why one beach is like that and it's so close on a little island. They're so different. But anyway, there's bits, you can find bits of green marble, green stones on St. Columba's, and you'll see in a few minutes I have a slide of a larger piece of that green marble. It was quarried on Iona until about World War I. And there's a tradition when you go to St. Columba's Bay that you pick up 2 stones. One stone you throw in the sea and let go of what it is you're carrying, and that's burdening you down. You take the other stone with you as a reminder of what you are going to take when you return home. Iona's location on the coast made it vulnerable to the Viking raiders who were seeking opportunities to plunder. The Vikings learned fairly quickly that monasteries were undefended, but they also had valuable treasures. One of the worst raids by the Vikings was in 825 when the abbot and his monks were killed for not revealing where the treasures were hidden in a place called Martyrs Bay, for obvious reasons, on the east side of the island. Fear of Viking devastation led eventually to Iona's treasures being moved to Ireland, which is why the Book of Kells is in Ireland and not in Scotland. The island eventually, in its history, became the property of the Duke of Argyll. Yes, there really was such a person. That's that whole region of Scotland. It was in 1899 that ownership of the abbey passed from the Duke of Argyll to the newly established Iona Cathedral Trust, which was committed to the restoration of the abbey for public worship. Partly what happened in those ensuing years was that because the Vikings were raiding so often, eventually monks left and went to Ireland and gave up on Iona for the most part. By the mid-12th century, Iona did become a Benedictine abbey, and it was destroyed during the Protestant Reformation in part because, if you know anything about the history of England and Scotland, the Protestant Reformation was not kind to the Catholic Church. Iona, however, continued as a pilgrimage site. Early tourists would still go and visit there. A church was established on the island, a Church of Scotland, Presbyterian Church, but as the abbey was restored, people would go and start worshiping, in the renovated church. Eventually, the island was given over to the care of the National Trust of Scotland, and today when you visit, there's a relationship between the Iona community, which I volunteered with, and what's called Historic Environmental Scotland, which maintains the building and the structure, thank goodness, because it's a terrible job to keep up a building that old. And so in the mornings, in the evenings, it was ours to use the church. During the middle of the day, a lot of tourists were there, tour groups were there. We just had to be working around the people and being a host to the visitors that came to what is a historic spot, but also a live and functioning church. Oops, can you go back? I'm not sure if I... Oh, okay, yes, go ahead. So this is what I told you. So in the 1930s, what happened was there was a Presbyterian pastor, a Church of Scotland pastor named Reverend George MacLeod, who the decline of shipbuilding in Glasgow, which had been the foundation of their industry and their wealth, just bottomed out. And so there were so many unemployed people in Glasgow, and this pastor saw the need. He also knew about Iona that was trying to be rebuilt. He had this, what at that time was a pretty revolutionary idea of bringing together seminary students, who at that time were people of some means to be able to go to seminary, and craftspeople, stonemasons and construction people, and together over a series of summers, they rebuilt the rest of the abbey. Okay. Oh, I'm sorry, can you go back again? So this picture on the left is what's called the chapter house. If you visit historic abbeys, you start hearing the same names over and over because they're used throughout different churches. And this is one of the oldest remaining structures in the abbey. A lot of it was in ruins when it started being rebuilt in the early 1900s. But this was there from much earlier time, from the Benedictine time, not all the way back to Columba, because 563, that would be quite a stretch. But this goes back to the Benedictine Abbey. Those alcoves are stone seating. In today's world, there's cushions. But we would use this for meetings and for different activities. Okay.
You could sleep in it. That's what I was wondering. Can you sleep in it?
Yeah, it's not big enough. The arches are about like that. So, by the way, if you have questions as I'm going through, go ahead and ask, because by the time we get to the end, you may or may not remember. So that chapter house probably dates back to the 1200s, and you can tell partly by the structure of it. It's a Romanesque kind of a archway, and that pillar is very old. Okay. So one of the things that's distinctive on Iona are the high crosses. Now, if you travel in Scotland or Ireland, you see a lot of the high crosses. What happened on Iona, because from a very early time, it was a pilgrimage site. These crosses were along the island, marking the way for people. You know, it wasn't a long pilgrimage. By the time you got there, the pilgrimage was mainly over. But it was marking the pathway up to the abbey. And early Christians, this was interesting. I learned that early Christians worshiped facing east. That was the direction from which Christ was said to appear on the last days. Now, the other thing that's interesting, the part on the left says, now a timeless symbol of Christianity, representations of the cross only became common in the 600s. Who knew? I didn't. The monks of Iona began carving the symbol in wood and stone, using the cross to mark graves, boundaries, landing places, and holy sites of Columba's many miracles. Columba in time was called Saint Columba, and part of the reason for the pilgrimage was people were coming to see his relics, his remains, and also this holy place where he had been. Okay, yes? So the high crosses, they are exactly what they say. They're tall, and they are used because they were tall, you could see them from a distance. So I believe, and that's why they were called that. I don't know any other reason except they were actually, I think they were shorter. You know, part of what was happening was the craftspeople were learning how to make something that tall because they had not been used as freestanding. You know, we think of the cross now, you see it in front of churches all the time, but they were learning how to make something that tall that wouldn't topple or that the arms wouldn't break off. So it was, but they were used as markers and also, you know, showing a pathway. Okay, let's keep going. So this is called St. Martin's Cross. It's the only original cross to survive intact. It's a single stone slab imported from the Argyll mainland. Monks would have faced the west, from the west side of St. Martin's Cross, looking east towards Mull. You see Mull in the background in that photo. And they would have known it's hard to tell now, but they would have recognized scenes on the cross that were carved from the Old Testament. Let's go forward with the next one, and there's the key, which is helpful. It's hard to tell otherwise. If you look, you can follow. It's been standing there over 1,200 years, so it's pretty worn down now. I think there's one more thing there. So this is just one of the high crosses. Some are replicas, some are in a museum, but this one, I love that it's been standing there for so long. This one had, there's hollow area at the end of the circle. The circle, by the way, was partly there to support the arms of the cross. And there's an empty slot where a part could be added in on holy days that was covered with jewels, apparently. So this was, no wonder those Vikings learned where to go. Just another little side note, it says on the right-hand side, some of the earliest images of the Virgin and Child come from Iona, where the Mother of God was particularly revered. The scene at the center of St. Martin's Cross was probably copied from the same source as the iconic page in the Book of Kells. So in the center of the very center of the circle is the Mother and Child. Okay.
Carol,
Yeah.
are you saying that the Celtic cross that we know was created because it had to hold the arms up?
Well, that was part of it because they were finding ways to make, I mean, I always learned that it was the circle, which meant no beginning and no end, the symbol for God. I'm sure that's partly, but it was also partly practical. Yes. Okay. So the church was obviously the center point of an abbey. It's still the center point of life, I'd say, on the abbey. There's a church that has stood on this site for almost 1,500 years. The latest being the church that was begun in the Benedictine monastery days in the 1200s. In the rebuilding of that church that happened in the early 1900s, they found fragments of the earlier church and realized that even though St. Columba's church had decayed and was gone, that it was the same location that they built it on. The nave, which is what you see on the right-hand side at the very end of the church near the entrance, was extensively rebuilt in the early 1900 renovations. And this is interesting, funds at that time were largely raised by the Church of Scotland's women's guilds. Okay.
Carol, what are
Yeah.
the two books?
The books on the benches. So part of what is, I'll talk about this in a few minutes, but part of what is so much a part of worship at Iona is the music. People come from all over the world. In fact, if you looked in our hymn book and looked up the name John Bell, who's one of the composers at Iona with the Wild Goose Publishing, there is a long list of his hymns. You also could look up Sally Morris, who I met. She was there volunteering as one of the musicians at Iona, and we've got a lot of her hymns in the hymn books, in our hymn book as well. Another little side note, if you look up hymn number 664, Jan, you want to do this, look at the very bottom. I don't know if you ever read at the bottom of our hymn books, but there's some little interesting information about all these hymns. And number 664, Morning Has Broken, the tune is Bunessan. And Bunessan is a little town on the Isle of Mull. So the books, there's actually, well, they changed during the time I was there. Things are always changing at Iona because they're trying to be aware of changes in our culture and changes in our language. And so there was a larger hymnal that's used throughout Church of Scotland churches and has a lot of John Bell's music in it. And then there was also specifically an Iona hymn book, a song book, and we weren't able to purchase. It's not ready for publication yet. They were trying it out. I know, I would have bought it otherwise. The hymnal was, too big for me to bring home, but I would have bought the other one. So the church has been altered through the ages. The monks would have spent much of their time in prayer. They attended 7 or 8 services, worship services a day. Well, I should say, and night, because one of them was at 3 a.m., I believe. The church is shaped like a cross, which is true of many churches of that time. The monks would have sat in the area that's called the choir.
Let me go back.
No, that's okay. You can see on the left-hand photo at the very bottom, there's pews. It's up close to the chancel where the altar is, or the communion table, that we called it. And the pilgrims would have sat in that nave where the folding chairs were. Originally, this is interesting, these walls would have been plastered and painted. Must have been beautiful at that time. Okay. So yes.
The restoration is from the bottom of the pillars up, is that it?
I used to sit, because I was in there all the time, right? I was there twice a day, and this was my work site, so I would look around, and I'd see new things all the time. Some things you could pretty obviously tell where the restoration had happened. Some things not so obvious. And it was done over so many periods. This church was built in the 1200s, but it was added to, it was cut back, it was restructured and changed. So you can't always tell where things were changed. Some of it because it was exposed to elements for a long time, from the Protestant Reformation till the early 30s, the beginning of maybe around leading up to World War I era. It didn't have a roof, so it was really exposed to elements. A lot of those pillars, the capital, the top of the pillar, have carvings, but they're very hard to make out, some of them, and see what they are. Some of them are scenes, but it's like that cross without a key. It's really hard to see them. So it's hard for me. There are historians. There was a historian there one time that walked us through at night. That was kind of fun, but she did it in the dark so she could, put a flashlight on some of these spots and we could see them better, because it's hard to say this is from this era and this is from that era, because it's such a hodgepodge of, and what we learned from her is that each abbot that would come in would have a different idea. It's like each pastor comes in and changes things a bit. So, yes. And there's one more. So I'm not going to talk about Celtic designs. If you want to know about Celtic Christianity, I'll come back another time. But basically, I think a lot of us know that Celtic has those interlocking lines, and that was visible. You'd see that a lot around the Abbey. So music is, as I said, a significant part of the worship services at Iona. We'd have something every Sunday afternoon called a wee sing, wee as in little in Scottish, the way that Scots use the word wee, W-E-E. And that would be a chance for guests and staff and volunteers to all learn the music that was coming that following week. Yes? Oh, the Sandhill Cranes are back. Oh, that's wonderful. Yeah. So this, by the way, that's the choir area that I was talking about. Again, if you go to any church of that era, you'll see probably what they call the choir. And in the Iona Abbey one, there are names that, there's little name plaques on some of the seats there.
That's bigger choir than ours.
Well, that was staff and volunteers and guests, some of them. It was a mixture of us. And there's a lot of instruments that are used. This man who's playing viola is a staff member, and there'd be guest musicians, and people who were guests for the week would bring their own skills and participate in worship. Okay. It's so damp in that building, and over the winter I was there at the beginning of the season, and there's an electronic piano, because they've had baby grand pianos, and they will not survive. Even the electronic piano was all wrapped up in plastic, and it still had issues. They only last a very short time, sadly, and then they have to be replaced because it's so cold and so damp in there. I learned from that historian, one of the problems when it was being rebuilt, the Abbey, was they were using the modern techniques from the early 1900s when they started that rebuilding process. They should have learned the techniques from the 1200s, because the materials they used have allowed so much moisture to come in, and the windows don't seal tight, so it's not like you see the wind, the candles aren't going, flickering, but You can feel it's pretty cold in there at the beginning.
Moisture's probably salty in the air, or not?
There's a lot of, yeah, I'm sure. Yeah, I couldn't sense it, but I'm sure it is because you're on a small island in the Atlantic. Okay. Any other? Keep firing your questions as you think about.
Looking at that picture, Carol, what was the weather outside if you were wearing scarves and that on the inside?
Well, we would talk about layered days, how many layers we were wearing. Now, I went the end of February, and because Iona is on the western coast of Scotland, of the UK, it is affected by the Gulf Stream, so it doesn't get bitter cold like here. But you put a wind and that dampness, and it feels, it was funny, before I left, I would look and it would say 40 degrees, feels like 12. And I'd think, how is that possible? Well, it is possible, I learned, because of the dampness and because of the wind. So I didn't take a warm winter jacket. I did take a lightweight down jacket, but on those cold days, I'd have the down jacket and I'd have 3 shirts on, lighter weight jacket and a couple shirts under that. So, yeah, so it could have been 40 degrees. It was obviously nighttime because it's so dark in there, although it's usually dark in there.
Did they have a heating plan?
I never saw any heating plan. I think that's why. So when I first got there, we were not even worshiping in the church. We worshiped in a small chapel. It was just too cold. And as I said, the electronic piano was all sealed up in plastic. And so it was a little while before we moved into the big Abbey church for worship. It was just too cold.
I'm curious,
Yeah.
was it ever warmer outside than it was inside?
I think so. Sometimes it felt like you would see your breath in there. They used to tell guests, it's okay to bring a hot water bottle to worship because it was so cold in the church. It did eventually warm up in there, and I imagine this time of year it's warmer in there, but it warmed up eventually enough that I was very comfortable. Okay. Let's see. So the liturgy is, as I said, there's always changes happening. I've got that little book up here if you want to look. There were different services for every day of the week, but it's a little pamphlet because it's always changing. They're aware that language changes over time and that, the basic format is the same, but the wording changes. And liturgy, when I was here and throughout my ministry for years, I used materials from Wild Goose, which is the publishing house of Iona, because their language is like poetry. It's so beautiful. This one, it says it was updated in March. So the other thing is the wild goose is the kind of the symbol of Iona, and the wild goose in Celtic spirituality is a symbol of the Holy Spirit. And if you think of a goose, they don't, I guess Canada goose was introduced to Scotland, which I think was a mistake personally, but there is a goose that is native there, and they're very much like our Canada geese. They're very noisy and they demand attention and they're raucous, and that's partly why they were used as the symbol of the Holy Spirit, that it gets our attention. Yes?
Last Christmas at Bethel's Festival of Christmas, they played The Wild Goose, which is a song based on that, of the imagery of
Ah, so cool. Oh, that's so cool. Yeah, I don't know if you all heard, Emma was saying that at Bethel last year they played a piece, Wild Goose, which was based on that idea and sounded like a goose. So cool.
Is that where the Wild Goose Festival that's in North Carolina comes from?
You know, I bet it is. There's a lot of Scottish people settled in North Carolina during the clearances. That's a whole nother history topic, but okay. So the morning services were always the same kind of format, Monday through, now Sunday's a different story, but Monday through Saturday we followed the format that's in that worship. But the evening services varied from day to day. They followed the same format, but every Sunday evening it was a quiet service. Monday was a service for justice and peace. Tuesday was a service of prayers for healing. Wednesday was called an evening liturgy or an environmental liturgy. Thursday was a service of commitment because guests were leaving then on Friday morning. And Friday evening was our one time of the week, morning, evening, when we didn't have worship. And Saturday morning, because new guests arrive Saturday afternoon, we'd have a service of welcome. And there's liturgy that's used. I don't know if you have the Iona liturgy book, but there's liturgy that we would base it on, but we would, we had freedom to change it as we wanted. There's often interactive components that are added into the services. Okay. So this is, I mentioned the green marble. You can see the very green marble on the legs of, that's the baptism font. It's huge and very solid. It's not going anywhere. And like in a lot of churches of that era, it's right at the front door because it marks that in baptism you are entering the church, the life of the church. There's one more. The communion table, it's hard to see, but it's also green marble. It's about, I think it's 10 feet long. Some of the detail you were asking John about the church, some of that carving with that head it's very old. There's different areas in the church you would learn that are older than others. And again, because it's so damp in there, there's actually ferns that grow on the walls.
And that's what the bottom one is. Yeah.
Yep, that's a fern. That's in the Abbey. In fact, if you look in the photo on the right hand, the top right hand window, you can see a fern. So, there was some, but not so much. But when we first reopened the Abbey, there were buckets because it was literally dripping. And so it's an issue, and they're forever trying to fix that and figure out how to. Some of it just comes through the mortar because, again, they should have used the original building techniques. Okay. Sunday morning was an ecumenical service, and sometimes I was asked if when Mass was, people in the church in the middle of the day would say, when is Mass? And I'd say, well, there is no Mass. This is an ecumenical community, and all are welcome, all are invited to communion. Now, only clergy who had certification in a church would be invited to preside. So I did preside at communion. I did also preach, but we would also invite people who were visitors, who were guests, to help. So not all that often did I help. There's that big communion table you can see. A friend of mine from seminary was visiting, and I was setting up communion, and she snapped a photo of me. That's me. Yeah, I think I might have been presiding that morning. So I did preside at communion. I think a highlight for me was on Easter Sunday when I presided, when the church was packed. And there were people who had been on a pilgrimage across the island, carrying a cross across the whole of Scotland and across Mull and onto Iona. Okay. So my work was in the sacristy. That's where retired clergy or clergy on sabbatical would get put, was working in the church. There's a bell that was rung before every service. People loved ringing the bells. The cross on the left was an interactive environmental service that I led. And then there's one more. Part of my job was keeping up the communion linens, which if you've ever ironed a cloth for a 10-foot table out of Irish linen, it's significant. In fact, there was a couple that were visiting. There was a couple that was visiting from the US, and they happened to come into the church, and I was ironing, and the woman helped me, and I thought, you know, what she's going to remember about her trip to Iona is helping with the communion linen. That archway behind me where I'm ironing is the sacristy. The sacristy traditionally has been where the linens were kept, the vestments were kept, the communion wine was kept, it's still kept there, where the silver, or in the case of Iona, they use pottery, where all of those serving pieces were kept. And that's actually the only room I knew on the Abbey that was locked. And I had a key. Okay, yeah.
That says all volunteer staff and any guests can participate. Is that including elders or laity, or?
We didn't ask who, I mean, people every Sunday, we had communion every Sunday, and people would help with serving, and we did not ask the servers, are you an elder? If somebody wanted to serve, it's part of the inclusiveness of Iona is to invite that we're all, that, you know, saying you have to be an elder is a human rule, that God welcomes us all to worship. Again, they were specific about presiding at communion. It was only clergy. But as far as leading morning, evening worship, not so much Sunday morning, except for serving. It was always such a job to serve that giant space and get servers, so it was always complicated. But that was anybody who wanted to, was invited. Okay. So we all were in different areas. As I said, I was in the sacristy. There was a sacristan named Denise. Sometimes there'd be enough guests in the week and we'd have volunteers that would help us with some of the tasks that we had in the church. Some of the other areas where people were volunteering was housekeeping, kitchen. Those were the two largest ones. Maintenance, administration, program, working in the shop and in the music. There are 11 staff on the island. There are more that live in Glasgow. So the cloisters in an abbey traditionally was always, there's the church, but then as far as day to day, the cloisters were always kind of the center of the life of the abbey and are literally in the center. It's an enclosed, it's you can see, you can get the sense that it's enclosed. Why don't you keep going? And this was rebuilt by George MacLeod and the people that came in the 1930s. And those pillars were mostly all replaced. There's a few of them that are traditional. They're beautiful. They all have different scenes at the top. And again, like the church originally, this would have been painted. It would have been gorgeous, but I still think it was gorgeous. I was glad for that cloister because you could, in the rain or the wind, you could always get around and never had to worry about getting wet. At the center is a statue by a Lithuanian artist from the 50s, and it's meant to represent the Holy Spirit and the Virgin Mary. Okay. Yes?
Is the abbey connected to the cloister so you could?
It's all, so that's see that tower in the left-hand side, the upper photo? That is the church. That's the church tower. So the abbey is built like a square, the very center being the cloisters, and then there's the church on the one side, there's guest rooms on the other side, there's what's called the refectory where we would eat, and the kitchens. There was another section called Lower West Range that you'll see in a minute where I stayed. So it was all, it's all built around this cloister. So it's all connected. You never had to go outside if you didn't want to all day. You could just move around the cloister to get wherever you needed to. Okay. So there was a pattern to how we lived our lives. One of the women that I became friends with at some point said, "We've become institutionalized," because our days were very prescribed. We'd have breakfast at 8, worship at 9, then there was time, either the guests would go off to their class, the staff and volunteers would go to our work. We'd have coffee break or tea break at 11, lunch at 1. The afternoon was classes or free time. Dinner was at 6, worship was at 9. Very prescribed pattern to our days. Now let me just read you our rule. If you know, like the Benedictines, they have a rule, the things that they commit to live by. In this case, it says, "Our rule as members of the Iona community, we commit ourselves to daily prayer, regular engagement with scripture and worship with others, working for justice, healing, and peace in our localities, society, and the whole of creation, meeting together, supporting one another, and accounting to each other for the use of our resources, money, and time, sharing in the corporate life and the organization of Iona community." Now, not that many people who were there were actually members, full members of the community, because it's kind of a process. It's a several-year process to become an actual member of the community. I'm an associate member, but there's a lot of steps that you have to take, and a lot of different meetings that you go to, which until COVID and doing everything remotely meant you had to really be in the UK to do it. Now today I think there are full members that live in other parts of the world. Okay, there's that cross, by the way, that one high cross, the original one. And then this one is a copy of one of the crosses that is in pieces now, the original. Okay. Let's see, where am I? We ate in the refectory, that's where this is, and that was just down from where I was staying. We all ate together. One of the things that makes Iona unique, I think, is that it's a living, breathing community of people, and that everybody who comes as a guest for a week is considered to be a part of the community and affect the character of the week. So every week was different because there were different guests every week. At first I found that hard, that people were coming and going, because you all ate together. You might even take walks together or go look at the stars together or watch for northern lights or whatever. You got acquainted with people and then they left. But then the next day a new group was coming. So one of the things that makes Iona unique, it's not a museum, it's not even a retreat center. As I said, it's a community of a Christian ecumenical community, actually spread around the world. The smallest majority of community members actually live at Iona. There's a team of staff and volunteers who welcome as many as 50 guests each week, spring through October. I think there's one more. This is the group of us volunteers at the very beginning I was there at the beginning of the season. Over the winter, it's pretty, there's not a lot happening, partly because ferries sometimes get canceled because of weather, bad weather. So they have pulled back the time when they have retreats, and they end them earlier in the fall. They used to do things through Christmas, but so often people couldn't get there because of the weather. So this was the group of us who arrived at the very end of February and got the Abbey open for the new season. And then one by one, people started leaving. One other woman, Sue, and I were there for 3 months. This is Sue. And the rest were there a month, 2 months. It's a very international place. The young people who are there, there's 3 of them, were from Germany. She's on a gap year. This young man is from Switzerland. To be honest, when I started, the end of February, who's available? Retirees. So it was largely an older crowd. Now that it's summer and people are on school holidays, I'm sure there's a lot more young people there who are working. Okay. So as I said, when I arrived there, it was a bit blustery, as you would expect it to be. And it was not long, though, before spring flowers were coming out. And the thing about Iona is spring lasts forever. We didn't have like we do here where suddenly it's 90 degrees. It was a long and slow and beautiful springtime. All right. I've lost track of where I am. Let's see.
How much time did you have to explore?
So my days, because I was working in the morning, I had to be there for morning worship. I was doing the sound system, and I was, turning on the lights and doing all those kinds of things. And then I would have tasks I needed to do in the church. But then I'd always get afternoons. They called mine a split shift, because then I had to be back for maybe some setup, or I'd have to light the candles for evening service. There's not a lot of lighting in that abbey, so you learn to sit where there was one of the lights, because otherwise it was reading by candlelight at nights. And so I had a split shift, so I was able to take a walk. Unless it was pouring rain or too windy, I would take a walk every afternoon. So that's why you'll see in a moment, I have so many pictures of taking walks, because I always had free time in the middle of the day. Not everybody did that. A lot of the people did, because like kitchen, they would, it was geared around the meals, and housekeeping, they could scatter their day too. But the music department and the sacristy, we had a lot of freedom in the middle of the afternoon. There were 2 houses where staff lived off-site. There were actually only 6 of us who lived at the Abbey, because I was working there until sometimes almost 10 o'clock at nights, especially in March when it was pitch black at 9 o'clock. I was very glad on those windy, cold nights that I was staying right in the Abbey. That winding staircase is the way up to the rooms, the room where I stayed. It was called the Lower West Range. That's my room on the right. I could have straightened it a little more for a photo, but there it is. And my windows were right here. That's where I lived. So I looked right down on the cloisters. I had a duvet. It was a duvet, and I just didn't straighten it very well for the photo or hang up my jacket. If I had thought about showing all of you, I would have straightened my room a little more. So it's lived in. And the thing that was nice, which I didn't know if I was going to have, I had my own room. All of us, all 5 of us who lived on this floor, and then there was one person above us who's the head of the Abbey on the island. She had her own room, and we all had our own rooms. There were 5 of us who shared a bathroom, but you know, you don't go volunteer at Iona unless you're a pretty easygoing and easily adaptable person, so we all made it work. Okay. So one thing I wasn't expecting was how much laughter and fun there was at, you know, you think an abbey, an old historic abbey, it's going to be serious and somber. We had a lot of fun and a lot of laughter and a lot of hikes, as you can see. A lot of time together, and we became really close because what else are you going to do? You're on an island in the middle of the ocean, and you spend time with these people who became good friends. So
Did you take the majority of these pictures, or did you?
I took all of them except there's like one I didn't take, but otherwise they're all my photos. Oh, no, I think there's one I did not. I didn't take this one. Otherwise, they're all mine. Okay. That's maybe not true. There was a selfie that Yelka took. Young people are much better at selfies than people my age, I think. So, Iona is a beautiful place. It's a gorgeous island. Every day looked different to me. And we had a long time in the spring where there was no rain and the sun would shine, and it was so gorgeous. This is right next to the abbey. It's a ruins of an old abbot's house. These are all the northeast side of the island. It was so beautiful. Let's see, where was it? I just used my phone. You know, the new phones have incredible cameras. Oh, I just saw the Sandhill crane take off.
Killdeer are back also.
Pardon?
The killdeer are back also.
Oh, are they? Aww.
Did they have flowers that were similar to what you would see here? What?
The flowers were very similar. The birds were not. Let's go forward one. You know, there were some birds. Oh, I put in some about Mull for Jan, I thought. And it was, Mull is beautiful. I would go back to Mull on vacation in a heartbeat. There's one more.
I'll go with you.
Okay, 2 more, 1 more. So Mull is a much bigger island. Tobermory is kind of on the north coast. It's this beautiful little village where all the houses and shops are painted these bright colors. The Highland coos, how many of you know about Highland coos? The cows that are very distinctive to that part of Scotland, and they look like you could just go up and touch them, but we learned one time when a baby was nearby, you best not do that. The mama snorted at us. This is gorse, which is kind of a ubiquitous plant in Scotland. There were standing stones we would go explore. We'd go, this woman is an avid bird watcher, so I learned from her a lot of birds. There was always an adventure to be had. And on our days off, it's just a little ferry ride, 10-minute ride over to Mull. And there were several of the women that were volunteering who were from Britain, England, who had driven their cars. Well, they didn't want to leave their cars sitting out in, you know, week after week in this damp, salt air place. So, oh well, do you want somebody to go with and have an adventure on Mull? So there were always things happening. When I first got there, I know one of the first days, it was so windy and so blustery, and I thought, what have I done? I'm here for 3 months. But the time went so fast. I kept a journal every day. I hardly ever read a book because the days were so full and so fulfilling. Okay, did somebody have a, yeah, Lonnie.
Did you go to Mull for groceries
We didn't have to. We were eating the Abbey food all the time. We didn't, for 3 months, I did not cook. I did not go to a grocery store. The woman that I became friends with, Catherine, said, our big decision for the day as we go out of the gate of the Abbey, do we turn right to hike or left to hike? That was our big decision in the day. It was, our days were very programmed. You know, there's something very appealing about having that time where you just kind of leave so much of what, as Drew was saying in her children's sermon, all those things you have to do. I let go of a good share of those for 3 months. And I think that's part of what makes Iona so special and a thin place, is because you do leave a lot of life behind.
Carol,
Yeah.
does that include technology? Is this sort of a technology-free place? No radio,
Nope.
no TV, no phone?
Nope. There was no TV. There was internet and Wi-Fi. I mean, our sound system ran off of the internet, and that's how I kept in touch with people. It's not like I didn't communicate with people for 3 months. I did communicate. But so it's not like you're removed. I did find I really limited my online time with the news. I was really metering what I was watching, and sometimes, you know, some of the British people would say to me, oh, did you hear what Trump said? And it's like, nope. And then I think, well, maybe I should keep up a little more. But it was, I just found I didn't find as much need to be online. And, you know, to be honest, I would go on the BBC to read my news because I was in England, or Scotland, you know, so. Every day was different. I don't know, do you all know this is the English robin? Adorable, about the size of maybe a chickadee here. Beautiful little bird. I was there during lambing season, and if you've ever seen a lamb jump into the air, they call it gambling. It is the most adorable thing possible. So some of the birds were the same, you know, crows and wrens and sparrows, but there were, of course, a lot of the coastal birds. This is one I loved called the oyster catcher. I loved the robins. I would hear cuckoos. Who ever heard cuckoos in this part of the country? None of us. So there was a lot. I got a Scottish bird book so I could learn the books that were there, or the birds that were there. All right, there's one more oyster catcher, and one more. This bird is called the corncrake. It's very elusive. It's hard to see. It lives in tall grasses. We would hear it all the time. It has this funny call, and there were bird watchers, you know, with their camera lenses that were from all over the UK and from France that were there, different places, trying to see that bird, and I finally found it. So.
It is hard to see.
It was really hard to see. I would have missed it except somebody was standing next to me and said, there it is, because I could hear it, but I wasn't seeing it. It was in high grasses.
Point them out to us. I mean, I'm having trouble.
Oh, okay. It wasn't a very good. I made it much smaller because my photo, it was very fuzzy when I enlarged it. So they kind of tip their heads back and go rah, 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 rah. It's a very annoying sound, and we'd hear it all the time. Okay, I think there's one more. So Iona, what makes it special for me, what makes it a thin place, is that remoteness, that you are so far away from your normal life. It's the beauty of the island, the people who are there. You don't go to such a remote place unless you are interested in learning about it. Having worship, being surrounded, your days were hemmed in with prayer and worship. Being in a place of history where you know people have prayed and sung and worshiped for all those years, I think it's got to be a place that's special and a place that's a thin place. So if you ever get a chance,
Would you go back?
I would go back tomorrow. I loved it.
I love the sunsets.
Yeah. That was actually a sunrise on
Sunrise.
Easter morning. It was an Easter morning. Yeah. So an abbey, I think, there's different terms for churches and for communities. And, like we have St. Paul, we have a cathedral. In Minneapolis, we have a basilica. Some of it has to do with the construction, the architecture, also what's done there. We have St. John's Abbey up the road in Collegeville, where there's monks who live and worship and do education and did the St. John's Bible, an illuminated Bible. I think it has to do with the function of what's happening there and who lives there and what the purpose of their existing. It's not, it uses the word cloister, but it's not like people are cloistered away and they don't, they talk. Some places you go and, people aren't supposed to speak to each other, That's not at all. Iona, from the very beginning, from St. Columba's time, was not meant to be a place where you were cloistered, where you were tucked away from the world. So as much as I loved it and thought, I could stay here forever, that's not what Iona was meant to be. It was meant to be a place where you are refueled, where you're learning about your faith, where you're engaging more with God and how God wants you to live your faith out in the world. So from the very beginning, it was designed to be a stepping out place into your living of your life and your everyday world, wherever in the world you live. Thanks. Good questions.
Any kind of sectarian spirit that
Well, it had,
dominated? Was it
yeah.
primarily basically Roman Catholics?
No, it has the Roman Catholicism in terms of the building. So we use the word abbey and cloister and nave and all these words that we would know from if you visit other Roman Catholic abbeys. I'd say it has a Presbyterian flair because George MacLeod, the founder of the modern community, was a Presbyterian pastor. It's got a bit of Anglican. They light candles. I mean, most of us in Presbyterian churches wouldn't think of having a row of candles to come and light prayers with. So there is a bit of the Anglican feel to it, but I'd say if there's any flavor, it is Presbyterian. So, but it is ecumenical. So
Does it have any connection to the Church of Scotland?
not anymore. It's run as an independent, a separate. You can go on their website. If you type in Iona, you might get Iona College. In upstate New York, you might get Iona, the historic part of the Abbey. You have to put in Iona Community, and then you get into their website, and you know there's a plethora of information there, including the application if anybody wants to go volunteer there. So anyway, it's where was I going? I lost my train of thought. Oh, yeah, I think if you go in there, you can look and see there's a board of directors. There's a structure. It's a pretty structured, it's an institution. So and I think of all the volunteers and staff who were there when I was there. Well, you saw how many volunteers there were, and there's about 10 staff there. Only one was actually Roman Catholic. The rest of us were, predominantly Protestant, so Presbyterians and Methodists and Congregational, and but from all over the world too. Certainly the guests come from all over the world.
And was most of the communication in English?
Oh yeah, it was all in English. Yeah. Yeah, the young man that was there from Switzerland, I think he primarily came to practice his English before he went to college. And it got much better in 2 months. So, Lonnie, you had a...
I just can't help but think when electricity got there, how
Yeah.
different it was.
Yeah, and I was fascinated with that infrastructure because, you're on an island, you're surrounded by water, but you can't drink that water. The water originally came from a lake that was on the island, but about in the 80s or the 70s, they realized that was probably not such a good idea. So now water is pumped in from Mull, as well as, the cable, there's underground cables for a lot of things now, I guess. I don't know. So electricity was not generated there. It's septic systems. There were signs all over, be careful what you're flushing, because this is a septic system. So, I found that infrastructure very interesting. Gordon, you had a question?
So, did you feel the spirituality?
I did. I certainly did. It's like I say when I go up to St. John's, I feel something special up there too. Not that everybody's perfect, not that the institution is perfect, but I think when you go to a place where, in the case of Iona, for over, since the 1200s, people have been praying and worshiping and trying to live their faith. I think it's got to affect the place. That's why I am such a fan. That's why I wanted to go back when I was there for just one little week, and I sensed it then too, 10 years ago. And partly because it's such a beautiful place, I think, is part of it. It's just so gorgeous and so remote and so quiet, which is why I could hear the cuckoos and the corncrake at night.
So, Carol, I've been thinking about the quarry and the green since my family used the Macquaries from Mull. And I assume, but I don't know for a fact, that there's a long history. My grandfather and his brother had a quarry in Colorado. Is the quarry still working?
The quarry on Iona has not worked for like 100 years. They stopped quarrying it, but you still would see rocks. You still could find the green stone around. I've got pieces I picked up and brought home with me. We hiked one day near a quarry on Mull, and it was not being used. The church is built with stone from Mull, the Iona church. So it was, I think there is still some quarry that's active on Mull, but the one that I saw was not active. So Mull is known for a kind of a more red stone, whereas Iona, the prized one is this green marble.
They brought the stone from Mull.
It's amazing. Well, and you saw there's no trees. And the center of that church is all timber. And it's all roof trusses out of timber. So everything is shipped in. That was interesting too about the infrastructure is, how do all these people on Iona eat? Where's all the food coming from? Well, there was a big old shipment would come every week. That little tiny ferry, it was amazing what a big size truck could fit on there. And it would come to the Abbey once a week and make this big delivery. Now, the one thing I missed on, the food was so good. It was delicious. It was all vegetarian. There was one meal a week had meat. And that's part of their environmental focus. They're trying to eat low on the food chain, and it's, cows take so much to feed, and then there's byproducts of cows that we now know is affecting our air. So the food was really good. The one thing I will say I missed was green salads, because that's very expensive to bring in lettuce. And the other thing that was kind of funny, we'd always have fruit. There'd always be apples and pears. Sometimes there'd be oranges, which they'd kind of say, oh dear, sorry, that's not environmentally sound to be bringing oranges from Spain. But if somebody went to Mull and went to the grocery store, they'd bring bananas, and we would get so excited at bananas. So, but it's such healthy eating because you're never snacking. There were no snack. You know, there was a little, kind of like a 7-Eleven, it was called Spar, so you could have gone and gotten junk food if you wanted to, but I never did, so I was never snacking, and there were desserts. The food was plentiful, but it was so healthy, and they were so aware of food restrictions. They were so good. In the kitchen, there would be a big sign up every week, a whiteboard, and it would say, you know, who couldn't eat peanuts, who couldn't eat coconut, who couldn't eat, you know, and they would plan the meals around what people's dietary needs. A lot of gluten-free, you know, dairy-free, whatever.
Did they say anything about what they would have eaten when the Abbey was first built?
I did not learn about that. That would be an interesting, what the food would have been, because again, it would have been shipped in. I mean, it had to, but remember, it's a 10-minute ferry ride across from Mull, so it's not like I was coming to Antarctica from South America. I mean, it was a wee trip, but still, it all had to be. There was a garden at Iona. The hotels had much more productive gardens. They did produce a few things at Iona, but they didn't have the gardeners to keep that running. Yeah.
That was my question, if they had a working garden.
Yeah, they have the goals of making it a better, more functioning garden, because the hotels do produce, they've got pretty big gardens. There's 2 hotels on Iona. If you ever go, you have to make reservations for where to stay way in advance, because there's not a lot of places to stay. So, any other questions? These are great questions.
You took wonderful pictures.
Oh, thank you. Well, these cameras today are amazing too. So.
You put all of these together on the screen?
I did.
On your
I
computer?
did. I thought in my retirement I would learn a new program. So this is the Apple's program. I didn't use PowerPoint. I thought, keep that brain, those gray cells going. I think there's one more.
Thank you, Carol.
You're welcome. Thank you, everyone.